Happy International Women's Day. Happy to all of us, because we all benefit from the deconstruction and demolition of patriarchy. It is gratifying to see so many of you here, and I wanted to say at the outset that there will be people in the room with personal involvement in seeking fertility, and so we need to be respectful of that. I think it's consider it a bit like what we discuss here when it comes to fertility really needs to be at a level where we give a full respect to people both in the audience and in the panel. There are people both in the panel and in the audience with personal involvement, but also with specialist knowledge, either from women's health or from other disciplines. That's by way of introduction. My name is Dan Reisel. Together with Joyce Harper, I head up the ethics teaching on the MSc in Women's Health at UCL. I wanted to say a few words in general about today and about our topic before I go on to introducing our distinguished panel. So the first thing to say is that the title of this debate, which is like last year, an ethics debate in the week celebrating International Women's Day. This year we've decided to focus on buying fertility on the internet or online through various means not regulated by the authorities at present, or not regulated by the HFEA, and to ask the question whether that's fair play or whether the risks outweigh the benefits. I wanted to also plug at the outset that this debate, like other debates we've had in the past, is part of the public engagement of the Center for Ethics in Women's Health that we are in the process of building at the Institute for Women's Health at UCL. So, buying fertility on the internet. Not every person, not every woman wants to have a baby, want to have a family. But for those who do, they face a number of choices. In some senses, it's the most basic thing in the world to have a child. But on the other hand, it is, or has become, one of the most technologically advanced and complicated and scientifically cutting-edge stories. And it's that meeting when the oldest story in the book meets the newest story in the book that the topic of today is born. And so sites like this have started out over the last 10 years. This is Co-Parenting Match, which matches donors to recipients, which is providing a link between most often a sperm donor and a woman or a couple seeking fertility. Another site which is quite commonly used is Pride Angel, also providing this, similar services, a not-for-profit organization that links people seeking fertility with people providing fertility. So in some senses similar to that of the regulated clinic in the UK, but obviously with important differences that our panel will touch on. The format of this evening is that each of the panelists will have 7 minutes to present their view, whether they think online fertility provision is outside of the regulatory framework is fair play or risky business. I should say as well that there's an empty chair, which is a woman called Lorna, who will join us at around 7 o'clock. She is a fertility, or has been a fertility seeker, and has a personal story to tell, and although she could only be here for 7, we thought it would be worth it to have her join our panel midway through, because it's so important not just to have the science, not just to have the ethics, but also to have the personal stories of involvement in this industry. So she will hopefully join us in the next half hour. After each of the panelists have given their views, we will open it for questions and comments from the other panelists, and then questions and comments from the audience. I purposefully have said comments because I think it can be very valuable to have statements from people which are not phrased in the format of a question. So if you want to just say something that you think belongs in this debate, then it is your right as well. In order to facilitate interaction, we also have a number of pieces of paper at the end of each aisle. If you don't feel comfortable speaking your question, you can write it and bring it to the front, and we will collect them. You can also tweet a comment at #UCL Women's Day, which is the hashtag for this week of events from UCL. And so, without further from me, I wanted to introduce our first speaker, who is called Bronwyn Parry, who is a professor of social science, health and medicine at King's, and she's also director of undergraduate studies at the Department for Social Science, Health and Medicine there. Bronwyn has published and taught and worked in a number of areas that tessellate with today's topic. So the growth of the life sciences industry, commodification of life, post-humanism, assisted reproduction, legal approaches to the regulation of nature, and the public understanding and reception of these topics. Her most recent book is Bodies Across Borders, which is about surrogacy in India. And she also has a current book called Bioinformation for Polity on the expansion of reproductive services in India. And that came out of the Wellcome-supported ethics program, ethics research program. And she also consults various government authorities. So Bronwyn Parry, Professor at King's College, to open up. I'll be the timekeeper.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much everyone for inviting me here to speak tonight on this very provocative topic, buying fertility online, fair play or risky business. So the first thing I think we know is that the ability to access fertility services online has risen exponentially in the last decade or so. So that is partially due to the fact that we can now detach gametes from the bodies in which they were originally generated, and they become what I would call sort of hypermobile. So they can be cryogenically frozen, shipped around the world, etc. So that means that people can access them in all manner of places and ways that they were never previously able to do. So that raises a number of set of questions, and I began by thinking about this first question, first set of questions that Dan put to me in an email, in which he said, so do we think buying fertility online, mainly buying sperm or arranging co-parenting agreement, that kind of thing, is a good thing that allows more people to access fertility, or whether the risks are too great? So for instance, no screening, safety issues, possibility of consanguinity, etc. Okay? And I began by thinking to myself, well, let's just begin. If we want to assess what the risks or benefits of that are, that kind of presumes, it starts off with a sort of normative presumption that we're talking about more risky or more available than ... what. So it presumes that more something than what we already have. So let's just think for a moment how we all currently, if we want to reproduce, how we would go about that business. So even though it's a Tuesday night, let's imagine that we're doing a bit of ethnography out there on the, Gower Street High Road. So how do people normally access fertility? And the first thing to say is I think people have an astonishing array of reproductive materials to choose from, don't they? So you've got anyone in the world out there that you can have a baby with if you want to. So people who have structural infertility just don't have access to that number of people necessarily. So for instance, their husband or their partner has sperm that's going around backwards or something like that. So they're going to have to go to a sperm bank where they're going to get a limited number of gametes to choose from. So the first thing to say is if you were to preclude those people from having access to these kinds of gamete banks online, then they would simply be, for the most part, unable to reproduce. And I think that would be highly discriminatory to those folks. So that's the first thing to say. Now, if you don't valorise the biological child, then you don't have a problem because you can just go and adopt one. However, what I always say in response to that is we live in a society in which the biological child is incredibly valorised. Now, I don't necessarily hold with that, but that's where we are. So if you want to say that, then you'd have to say to people who already have biological children, well, you know, think about the fact that you couldn't have your own biological children. How would you feel about that? And they might not feel so great about it then. So that's one thing to think about. So the second thing to think about is how they go about having those children. So is there any screening, do you think? Is there any, you know, do they go through processes of judging the worth or not? What are the safety issues associated with procreating children? I can tell you what, a lot of people procreate children without one single nanosecond of thought about any of those kinds of issues. So what then does it mean if we take those services away from the face-to-face and we put them into an online or virtual environment? So I think the key question we have to think about here is what changes as a consequence of that, and therefore what responsibilities does that invoke in us? So the common argument is we're intervening in this process. So that what's going on Gower Street High Road on a Saturday night, that's a kind of natural process. And what we're doing is we're creating banks and matching people up in ways that we're intervening, and therefore we have obligations when we intervene to make sure that these things are carried out in the right sorts of ways. Now I'm just going to take one example to illustrate my case about how the shift from the actual to the virtual changes those relationships. So the example I'm going to use is in the UK. I'm going to just briefly touch upon surrogacy. Now, it's very interesting, I think, that social media has provided the perfect avenue in the UK through which to negotiate surrogacies away from the institutional gaze of the clinic and to enable it to take place in a variety of, shall we say, rather fluid domestic environments. Okay? So the position as it exists in the UK at the moment is that it's a crime to advertise for a surrogate or to offer your services as a surrogate. Nevertheless, it happens every single day in the UK, and that is all being negotiated between individuals on social media. Through sites that you can get onto on Facebook, for instance. I'm a lurker on many of them, loving intended parents and so forth. And what they do is they match up these people, okay? Now, again, it's also illegal to pay a surrogate a fee. However, agencies recommend expenses of up to £15,000 for medical bills and so forth and so on. So people are also paid. But what that means is that there is, however, the HFEA have demurred from responsibility for regulating that sector. So they have gone, I don't think I want to know what's going on over there, and frankly, who can blame them? Because it's a messy, messy business out there in the world of that kind of online organisation of matching up for surrogacy purposes. So but consequently, one of the very interesting results of that is that responsibility for oversight and monitoring of these surrogacies has kind of devolved, if you would pardon the vernacular, in the most loosey-goosey sort of way to a load of agencies, for example, people like Childlessness Overcome Through Surrogacy, COTS, no, slur on their reputation, but they're agencies that have set themselves up as people who are arbiters of these kinds of arrangements. So all they're doing is trying to provide a social service for the people involved. So they say, well, you might want to try and establish a kind of a contract between each other that looks a bit like this. So for instance, ask the surrogate if they know what they're getting into, if they understand their obligations and so on. But it is so far from a highly regulated situation that you can hardly imagine anything less regulated than this. And also they have also taken on responsibility for doing quite a bit of sort of vetting of prospective parents on the part of, surrogates and so forth. With what authority, who knows? But they have filled that kind of void or gap that exists there. So it's very interesting to contrast that with what is actually going on with surrogacy in India, which is my main field site, where despite being characterised as, and I quote, the wild west of surrogacy, surrogacy is actually highly contractualised in India and in Mumbai in many ways. And in fact, those contracts are not only highly detailed, but usually fairly rigidly stuck to. Now here, what you get is situations in which you see, and I have documented online, and you can take screen snips of people discussing these surrogacies, where they've have been quite seriously ripped off. So in other words, there are a lot of fraudulent, people out there who are offering surrogacy services. So what they do is they sort of get you into a conversation, and of course the commissioning parents are extremely vulnerable, because what happens in that situation is they're desperate for a child, and they can pay money up front, or they can enter into what they think is a surrogacy contract and then pay an initial payment to someone, and then that person just clears off once they've got the initial payment. And then where are you legally? You have absolutely no recourse whatsoever. I might add as a little footnote, since we're being inclusive on International Women's Day, some of the people who are most vulnerable in that circumstance are actually gay men who are trying to commission surrogacy. So they're completely vulnerable. So all I would say, to wrap up, is that here it would seem in the heartland of kind of regulation, we have no regulation. What a curious thing that is, I think. So in the virtual world of social media, if we think about it, we've actually, returned to a situation that mirrors in many ways the norms of unassisted reproduction. So you pay your money and you take your chances with what you get. But what I would say, I think finally, is that if we do decide, and we have decided, I think, that we, in instances where we are assisting reproduction, where we are intervening in that natural process, we are acting as instruments, if we feel we need to in some way, that comes with additional moral or ethical obligations to us, if we're going to intervene in assisted reproduction, then I think at least we need to be consistent in terms of how we apply that. So we apply those principles in the same way, whether we're talking about the virtual online world of assisted reproduction, or whether we're talking about the highly regulated space of a medical fertility clinic. So I think we do need to be consistent there, and that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bronwyn. It's very appropriate then, I think, to go on to Laura Vitchens. Speaking of regulation and whether the Wild West is here, because Laura is the Chief Executive of the National Gamete Donation Trust. And that is one of the national bodies that are involved with the regulation and procurement of egg, sperm and embryo donations. So she's also been quite open about her own fertility journey, and she's had a number of previous engagements in this area, and she's very visible in the landscape, commenting in the media and in the newspapers. As part of her work setting up the National Gamete Donation Trust, she also spent the last few years speaking with hundreds of donors and users of these services, and so she has that as part of her perspective as well. Laura Vitchens.
Thank you for having me on the International Women's Day. We have got an international panel today, so we do our bit. I was a 20-year-old student in Amsterdam, and I made a list of the things I was going to do in my life, the things I was going to achieve. And clearly, in hindsight, most of the things on that list were, of course, I didn't make because it was hugely ambitious. But on top of that list, it had become a mother. And I realized there and then that I would have done everything illegal, immoral, and unethical to have my own children. Now, fast forward 15 years later, and I wasn't halfway through that list, but in the meantime, I had to become a mother. I was very lucky. I was very fortunate because I had the perfect throw, as they sometimes call it. I had a girl and a boy twin. And they were natural, so my fertility journey started somewhere else. And I realized again that I was lucky because, again, I would have done anything illegal, immoral, and unethical to my own wish of a family. And all the other things on my list were insignificant because that was indeed one of the most important things. And it's with that thought that I decided to do something and share my luck. I had children. There are other women out there who couldn't, so I decided to become an egg donor. I went through very invasive IVF shitty treatments. I was menopausal at the age of 35. Because of that, gained weight, all of a sudden realized why my mother was grumpy at a certain time. And I did that because I wanted to help another woman to fulfill her, presumably, dream to become a family. Now, why is this relevant if we're talking about buying infertility on the internet? It is relevant because I want you to know, and I want the people to know, that my purpose has always been helping other women. I do not work for a clinic. I have no extra grind. My salary is paid by the Department of Health, which is a charity, and I get paid less than a secretary of the biggest clinic in London. What I do try to do, and as Den said, I've been in this field for quite a long time now. I seek to understand all people involved, because in the end I started this as just another mother and just another egg donor. The fact that by now I am the chief exec of the National Gamete Donation Trust, which includes National Sperm Bank, and I am one of the better known media commentators of fertility issues, is because I try to understand all parties involved. Now, going back to why I became an egg donor, I realized I would have done everything illegal and immoral and unethical. I was lucky, but now I realize that if I would have had to make that choice, I wish there was somebody out there like me who had spoken to all these people and would have told me, Laura, I understand you, but for fuck's sake, read the small print. And this is where I am here, to tell you the small print. I've had dealings with this sector for over 10 years now, and with this specific part over 10 years ago. Possibly many of you in the field may still recognize the name mannotincluded.com. That was the very first website, started in 2002, where a man, John Gonzalez, saw a gap in the market and started a website where he was linking patients or customers with donors. Now, I had a huge running in with him on a BBC radio show, and I was cut out because I dared to call him a crook. I was vilified by quite a few people because I didn't understand the issue. The fact that Mr. John Gonzalez ended up in jail a couple of years later, although for something unrelated, but he showed his true colors. Since then, lots have changed. Thank God we don't have a John Gonzalez. He was shut down as well by the HCVA and another group because in actual fact they were procuring sperm, which is illegal. What is happening at the moment is not illegal because, as was said before, it's effectively an online, this is what's happening now, is dating with an after, with the intent to have sex. Hello, that's why you've got Tinder. What's the difference? What he did, Men Not Included, was actually different. He combined them and organized the transport, and therefore he was effectively dealing in tissue, and that was illegal. So a lot has changed since then, and one of the slides that Dan showed was Pride Angel, which is one of the bigger organizations. And they do say it's best to go via clinics. But the one thing, the couple of things that has remained the same, and this is for me the small print. We have a toxic combination of women who, like me, would have done everything illegal, immoral, and unethical to have children. You have got many men who abuse their position of having that bit that women want to have their children. And the interesting thing is what you also still have is the unwillingness to accept that there is a lot wrong with this sector. There's utter denial of what is going on in real life. And of course we mask it with beautiful language because having babies makes beautiful pictures. But that's, and we use the term happy and family, but mask the issues. So what are the issues? Now, let me first say that I have been trusted with lots of confidential information and have spoken to hundreds of patients and donors or customers and users, and I will not betray their trust. So you have to believe me that if during the debate I'll probably talk a bit in riddles, but that is because I have spoken to quite a few people and they trusted me. Admittedly, there have been times that I wanted to throttle, absolutely kill, not just the donors, but the women. And there were moments that it's actually very difficult for me as a now professional to think, oh, you made your own bed, no lie in it. But in the end, I still wanted to help. Let me also realize make it clear that by talking to many donors and patients, that like everything in life, there is no guarantee. And what it is for most people, right, what is happening, it's right enough. I am not stating that online sperm donation is the most dangerous thing. It's not. It often goes right. But I don't ask you to put your hand up, but statistics will tell you that not many of you, thankfully, will have been sexually abused. If I would use the logic of the people who are critical of critics of me, it would mean that, therefore, we shouldn't take sexual abuse seriously, because it actually happens to the minority. And I use that sexual abuse issue deliberately, because one of the things we're dealing with is that women who, and in many cases especially lesbian women, because of meeting guys online who use aliases and not their real name, find themselves in hotel rooms agreeing to the practices of artificial insemination. In the end, the man says, actually, I can't get it up, and this is a very sterile travel lodge, I need partial insemination. And for some of you, this is probably the first time you've heard the term partial insemination, or natural insemination. I had women call me saying, I'm a lesbian and I just lost my virginity. They're shocked. They actually had sex with a man, but they also are shocked because they allowed that to happen. The most important thing is, of course, is the children. What do you tell to your child if the donor is proud about the fact that he has 800 children, he's fathered 800 children? How do you even how do you begin that conversation with your child? You've got 800 half siblings. How do you say to your child, in actual fact, you don't know much about the donor? The donors will argue, well, yeah, they do know me, but I do know that many donors actually are using alias, and you don't know their medical background. Well, it's absolutely true that if you walk around here and you pick up a guy, you don't know the medical background either. But fact is that you have known the guy a bit longer. Very few people have sex with the intention to have a child at the very first date. They probably have sex, great, but not with the intention to have a child. What do you tell your children or your child that you met their donor in the car park of the ESTA, and all you know is that he handed over a still warm cup through the window of his car? And if you think I'm making this up, read my Twitter feed, because that was the communication I had with the donor. I want to conclude by saying I know that this doesn't always go wrong, and I urge the sector, in actual fact very, very similar to you, to recognize that this is happening, and what we should be looking for is a system that combines the safety and security of clinic with the flexibility and possibly choice of the online sperm donation. I'm not against, because I do understand these women. I just want them that they don't have to go illegal, immoral, or unethical.
Thank you, Laura. Lucy van der Wiel is a research associate at Cambridge at the Department of Sociology in the Reproductive Sociology Research Group, which is headed by Sarah Franklin. Her research focuses on the social and cultural analysis of assisted reproductive technologies. She currently has a project called Freezing Fertility, which examines the more widespread trend of egg freezing and the cultural messages that are embedded in that endeavor. She also has a public engagement program, a piece of research which is funded by the Wellcome Trust, called Life in Glass, which explores the social history of IVF. Lucy van der Wiel.
Thank you, Dan, for inviting me here today. Thank you all for coming. I want to say, first of all, Happy International Women's Day. I'm glad it's a real honour to be here, and it's very nice to talk about reproduction on this day, because we all come from women and we need to celebrate that. So the question about fertility and online markets, there's a number of good things about it, such as lower costs, more availability, possibly more choice, more information about donors, more access for people who may not have had it otherwise. It may be more efficient, but there's also a host of problems in terms of privacy, security, health and safety, legal rights over the child, so who's recognized as the parent, and the treatment of donors. So that's kind of just to put it generally. The question is, if we are moving towards a situation in which certain people become implicated in the reproductive wishes of other people, and in which certain people provide bodily substance, such as egg or sperm, for other people, framed in a discourse of altruism and beautiful babies, while in fact a lot of other things are happening at the same time. So I think it's important when we consider these issues, especially when we look at internet markets of egg freezing, and not egg freezing, but egg donation, as well as sperm donation, and what other kinds of inequalities are implicated in the exchange of bodily substances. So who has access to the treatment, who is considered to be worthy of being an intended parent, who can access these substances in terms of, sometimes in different legal contexts, different people have access to eggs or sperm. They have to be married, they have to not be married, they have to have a partner of the same sex or not, they have to be with someone else, or they can be alone. So those questions of who has access is an important question. And on the other hand, who is donating is an important question here. So are they donating because they, as in the case of our other speaker, because they feel truly altruistic, or are there other motivations in place, and can we think of those as financial hardship, for example, and what are the consequences of that? So that's kind of a basic approach to this question. Then the question is, of course, whose eggs and sperms are desirable? How is this desirability presented? So when we look at online platforms, a great part of what's happening is the presentation of different donors as being desirable in certain ways, often by categorizing them according to weight, height, ethnicity, and other education levels. And it's important to look at those structures as they are emerging at the moment, to think about how we make reproductive choices and how that shifts. So these points have all been made, and the issue about the commodification that emerges with this kind of trade and online trade is something that we have to keep in mind. But there's two issues that I really want to briefly focus on while we are here. And the first one is specifically the internet-based dimension of this. So when we move from clinical platforms to online platforms. And I went to a talk yesterday by José van Dijk, who's a Dutch media scholar, and she talked about the platform society. And what she basically talked about was the increasing influence of online platforms on everyday life. And she defines a platform as an online site that organizes data streams, economic interactions, and social exchanges between users. And what we see happening, what we're talking about today, is how this happens in the fertility context. How these platforms, these online platforms that get an increasing influence all across the board, also affect how we reproduce. And most people's first point of contact these days will not be a doctor or a clinic, but a search engine or a website. And therefore the notion of a platform society that Van Dijk develops brings internet platforms as a condition of possibility for a respatialization of reproduction, in which people are brought together across different spaces, across different contexts, in order to, within a logic that's often presented again with a very altruistic and a very beautiful surface, but at the same time has very specific infrastructures going on that are very different from what was happening before. So while a lot of the debate about these issues is primarily concerned with the donors, with the recipients, with the clinics, we also have to look at when things move online, which other parties become involved. And what we see is that there are far more brokers and agents and online actors that are involved that make a profit out of the fertility need of people and take an important role in this process. They take an important role, like traditional media, not only by capitalizing on the need that exists, but also by producing the need and producing the terms of the ways in which this need may be met, so by producing certain solutions. And just one brief example is a site like fertilityauthority.com, which has 1 million visitors every month in the States. But that site is not simply an information site in a forum itself, but has recently merged with a manufacturer of a particular machine that is used to select embryos, for example. So the specific organizations that are behind the online platforms and their needs and their ideas about how they want to frame this reproductive quest for people is a very important thing to keep in mind that's often invisible. And that is also José van Dijk's point that a lot of the online platforms have data streams, have needs of different organizations that are not directly visible to the users, and what we see are the beautiful services. So these platforms are also often disruptive platforms. So as we have Airbnb disrupting the hotel sector, these platforms that we saw in the presentation just now that we'll be talking about today can be seen as disruptive platforms for the fertility industry and ideas of regulation. So this disruption often moves in terms of bypassing regulations and moving towards more peer-to-peer networking, thereby creating new relations between the local and the global, because an important part of this aspect of things going online is, of course, that you move away from a local distribution of reproductive substances and you create larger distances between different people, and thereby also disruptions in how things are regulated and what kind of regulation applies to what kind of practices. So if no longer the states can regulate this, if no longer specific institutions can regulate this, who is in control of the exchange of reproductive substances? And that's something that we'll talk about today. So besides the platform society, the second issue that I briefly want to mention before we get started is gender politics of aging that is involved here. And both the ages of the donors and the recipients are an important factor. So oftentimes these issues are discussed in terms of issues about sexuality, about race, about gender, but also age plays an important role in intersecting with the kind of political inequalities that happen in reproductive trade markets. So in relation to donor eggs, what I think is really interesting is the way in which what fertility means is changing. So rather than fertility being something that a particular human subject embodies on its own or on her own, the fertility nowadays has shaped through an egg-based model, so that eggs become an important container for the fertility alongside women's bodies. And you see this a lot in the debate surrounding egg freezing, for example. So in that way, there is a certain way of imagining fertility as having several ages. And the age-specific effects on the one hand is that, in terms of egg donation, is that on the one hand, becoming old doesn't necessarily mean becoming fertile in the same way. So you see a lot of clinics capitalizing on older women. So for example, specifically marketing women over 40 to come to their clinic through egg donation and being able to have children, or at least advertising the ability to having children with egg donation. And a large part of that is the availability, the unavailability or the availability of eggs, whether locally or globally. And on the other hand, and part of that is more women having children at later ages, and therefore being a more demand for egg donation. And on the other hand, the younger women who are approached for egg freezing, often younger women with youth unemployment, with higher tuition fees, have lower financial means but higher fertility. So what we see happening is that there's an increase in younger women, also in the UK, donating eggs. And so there is a kind of movement from low fertility and high financial means and requiring the eggs of people with high fertility and low financial means. And in that way, a distribution of what reproductivity and what fertility means as it intersects with aging. So I'll just leave it at that for the moment, but I think there's a lot to say here, and I think it would be great if we could have this discussion with everyone together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucy. Our next speaker is Lorna, and I'm going to let Lorna introduce herself, I think,
Okay,
because she's just come here. I apologise on her behalf that we did want to include her because she's coming from a clinic where she's a trainee clinical psychologist.
I'm a trainee clinical psychologist.
Right, so coming up, and she had a clinic that was that we knew was going to run late, but we thought it was so important to hear her story.
So yeah, apologies for being late. Yeah, my name's Lorna. I'm a former student. I got my PhD a month ago here at UCL.
Yeah.
So, but I am here in a capacity of a layperson today, as somebody who has used websites like Parry Angel to. Maybe I'll just skip back a little bit. I am gay and I always wanted children. So like you, always knew I was going to be a mum or wanted to be a mum. Didn't quite know how that would work out or how that would happen. And then when I got to the age of about 35, I wasn't in a relationship, and I thought at the time I didn't feel like I had the time to spend finding a relationship and then going on from there. So I actually decided to use these websites to find a co-parent rather than a donor. And at about 36, I started looking. Used 3 websites. Pride Angel was one of them. And it took a process of about 2.5 years, I think. I dated 15 men over that period, and it was quite a roller coaster ride, because it is, just like Tinder and everywhere else, it's unregulated. You don't know who you're talking to. And so I did have some. I took the approach that you would if you were dating. I always met people in public places, and I took an approach as if I was dating, in a way, as if I was going to find out about that person, find out everything I could. And yeah, met some creepy men, got lots and lots of emails from creepy men about how they could rock my lesbian world, and give me a baby in the process. And there were times where that was, it depended on my emotional state as to how I would receive that. So sometimes that was quite fun. Well, I could see the humorous side, that they were just idiots, and the other side was quite depressing, because you still haven't found anyone. You've been through 7, 8 men, and it's creepy and uncomfortable. And so yeah, I'll fast forward to man number 15, who was a lovely, lovely man, and we hit it off immediately and knew that we were interested in each other, and so we dated for a year. We dated just like you would date anybody, except there was nothing sexual, nothing physical. And then after a year of dating, we started to try and conceive artificially with a syringe and a cup at my house. By that point, I felt we would become good friends, and then fast forward 3.5 years on, I think, we're very good friends. We've conceived 3 times, we've miscarried 3 times. He's stuck by me through all of that. He could have left by now and gone back on the internet and chosen somebody much, much younger. But we are very closely connected, we have a good relationship. Been through a lot, and we're intent on becoming parents together. He is gay, by the way, and after the first handful of emails, mostly from straight men that were pretty offensive, I then decided to just look for gay men to co-parent with, and that was an easier process. So yeah, we're at the point now. I'm sort of kind of in my life. I'm 43, so I feel like I'm kind of running out of time. We started this process together at 39. But he is one of my best friends, and I adore him, and I'm glad that I found him. So that's the perspective that I bring, and that's not to say that I agree, disagree, with the arguments that will be here on the stage tonight. But that's sort of where I am, or in what capacity I come, is as a layperson who has used them, and so I can share that my perspective from that point of view. But it is more of a co-parent rather than a donor. And actually, just add that other bit, I always knew I wanted to be a parent, but I always knew I wanted my kids to know who their biological parents were. And there's been times where I wish that hadn't been important to me, because I might have been pregnant, or I might have had a child by now, because if I had started at 36, When I did get pregnant in my late 30s, I did get pregnant very quickly, and after 2 months and after 3 months each time. So there, it has run through my mind, what if I'd just gone for a sperm donor at 36, would I have children now? And maybe I would, but going back and doing it all again, I'd do the same thing, because it was important for me, for my children to know who their biological parents were. And I am now at the point of potentially thinking about donor eggs, and for that same reason, I would not source them on the internet personally. I would go through a clinic, because I would want my children to know who their biological parents are. So that's my perspective. Feel free when we get to that point to ask me any questions. I'm very open about my journey, so ask any question you like. I'm quite happy to share that perspective.
Thank you, Lauren. I imagine there will be a number of questions, both from the panel and the audience. And thank you for coming and taking the time. Andrew has been involved in a range of businesses and projects in the fertility sector as well. He's advised teams on both a commercial basis and a pro bono basis in areas as diverse as fertility technology, surrogacy, sperm banking, and private donation websites. As with all our speakers today, he's unable to comment on a personal history of private gamete donation for legal reasons.
Hi, thanks for taking the time to come and listen about a subject which I think is both very important and also considerably less interesting than I think many people might think. I think it's important to compare, as the first speaker did, the reproduction online versus reproduction in the real world. If you want to find a bunch of idiots, you can do that very quickly on most dating sites. You will get dick pics on chat roulette, you will get creepy men on Tinder, you will get the opportunity to pay for access to people who will want a sexual relationship with you on Match.com. And the sector that we're discussing today is really not a whole bunch more different from that than you can't get a RISLA between the two sectors in many cases. And I think it's a misnomer really, the way that this is described, this lecture. What we're discussing today is not about buying fertility online. There are ways you buy fertility online. You can go to a conventional clinic, they'll buy gametes online, they'll have them shipped from America or Denmark into the UK because the HFEA has failed utterly to provide enough gametes for the fertility sector in the UK. They will buy those gametes online. One of the clinics that I advise in the US is probably, although I don't get exact figures because of the nature of the work that I do, larger than the entire UK fertility sector. I know personally donors at clinics like that who have got 800 or more children, biological children. They are in the regulated sector. They are the kind of donors that you might get if you went into mainstream HFEA regulated clinics in the UK and paid for fertility. So what you're seeing here in this community-led, platform-led, peer-to-peer world of fertility is really not much. It's got much more in common with everyday relationships than it has with the more sensationalist, perhaps the titling of this lecture, and also some of the more extreme stories that you might have heard today. The truth is much more prosaic, much more boring, much more mundane than the sensational stories you often get in the media. Most donors don't have huge numbers of children. Most women don't get in situations which are horrendously uncomfortable. Most people do not have children with people that they have not bothered to do any basic research on. They meet people, they get to know them, either through correspondence or face-to-face or both. They make a choice between a range of people. They have a reasonable choice, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. And they have a child using a route that works for them. The vast majority of people, as I understand it in this sector, choose artificial insemination. People are typically not in a situation where they're expected to do anything other than that which they would want to do. I'd estimate around 80% of conceptions are from artificial insemination. The You know, the situation where people are pressured to have sex with people. I'm not saying it never happens, but this is a more boring world than you might think. It's not the mainstream normal story. Yes, there are men who only donate because they want sex, but in reality, they get no's an awful lot more times than they get yeses. Let me talk to you about journeys of people I know personally who've gone through this kind of experience. One of my good friends, has been a friend of mine for a long time, she went to a clinic, paid a lot of money, decided it wasn't for her, got offered 2 or 3 profiles, no photos, no video, no reliable vetting of the donors, just a short snippet of information, bit of career information, no checks, very cursory medical checks, no real way of telling who she was or wasn't using. That wasn't right for her, and so she stepped away, used a private donor. She tried in using natural insemination. She eventually settled on artificial insemination, went on to have a child, well adjusted, growing up, has the possibility of accessing that donor, having a relationship between the donor and the child to the extent that she wants and the child wants throughout the years when that child's growing up. That's not open to anybody who uses a UK fertility clinic. If you want your 5-year-old child to understand what it's like to be donor, if you want your 12-year-old child to understand why they look a certain way, why they think a certain way, why they feel a certain way, they can't. There's no legal way that can happen, not until they're 18. For many people, having that relationship, maybe it's once a year, maybe it's letters, maybe it's every weekend, that's vitally important for them and for their child. Why should the state stand in the way? Why should the state say what we can and can't do? Why should the state regulate what we do with our bodies, what we do with our children, how we bring people up? Do we want to live in a totalitarian state where these kind of very personal decisions are commanded to us by 600 mainly old white men who tell us what to do? Haven't we moved on from that in International Women's Day? Shouldn't we have more choice and more freedom? Another example, lesbian couple I know them very well. They've chosen to have 2 children. They decided to use natural insemination. It didn't make them straight. It wasn't something which disrupted their relationship. They're still happy together. They chose that methodology. They have 2 kids who are growing up, seemingly well adjusted, seemingly in a very happy relationship. That worked for them. That was their choice. I don't criticise anybody who goes to a fertility clinic. I want there to be a good, well-regulated clinic sector in the UK and around the world. I think it's important that people have the right and the choice to use clinics, okay? But I don't think that what we've got, does that mean I have to shut up?
Nope.
I will do soon anyway. I don't want anyone to feel that they shouldn't go to clinic if that's right for them. But what I would want, and this is not what we have in the UK, I would want, and I hope many people here would also want, a clinic sector which meets the needs of the people it's serving. There should be choice, it should be safe, and it should be affordable. And there's none of those things in the UK clinic sector. There's very little information on the donors you use. Often very few donors to choose from. The process is cripplingly expensive and is underfunded by the NHS. And sadly, and I'd say this advisedly based on a lot of experience, I know that clinics in the UK systematically misrepresent their services, systematically encourage people to use more invasive, more dangerous medical procedures than they need to use for their fertility clinic, for their fertility condition. IVF is routinely oversold. IVF is not something that's dangerous in the same way that having a appendectomy is not dangerous, but it's something that you do when you need it, when it's essential, when it's important. It's not something that you do because it's a good way of the clinic making profit. And sadly, we've got a system in the UK which favours clinics who are mercenary, who take advantage of people's desperation to have a child, to missell the medical treatments that are risky and that they do not need. I want that to change. I want people to be able to use clinics that are safe, that have choice. I want people who choose not to use clinics to have great legal support in the UK, to be able to write agreements between donors and recipients that properly regulate the experience of parenthood, to get rid of the grey areas, to get rid of the discrimination against cohabiting couples versus their married compatriots or civil partnership compatriots who have a very different legal regime. A single person in the UK cannot form a donor-recipient relationship in law. There is only a parent-child relationship unless you go to a regulated clinic. Someone who is married or in a civil partnership can form a legally valid donor-recipient relationship. That's not fair. I don't think that should be the case. This is a sector, both through clinics and through the unregulated sector, that is failing to serve the needs of the people who use it. And I would like to see changes across both sectors. I think that there needs to be much more support for the unregulated sector, much more recognition of the unregulated sector, and the clinic sector needs to be transformed so it truly serves the needs of its patients and is not any longer an organisation run by profit-making fertility clinics for profit-making fertility clinics. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for your contributions. I think in these kinds of debates, it's tempting to often ask who's to blame or who's the villain, and it often, perhaps a bit like Andrew said, the truth might be a bit more prosaic than that. There might be a number of unmet needs, a number of people who come in at a disadvantage, whether that's financial or otherwise, and the various things that are out there to help them not meeting those needs. We've heard that the fertility sector, the unregulated side of it, is some kind of mix between chat roulette, Tinder, and Airbnb at a crippling cost. It doesn't. It isn't always, as we know, an easy place to be. But then again, the regulated sector is also not such an easy place to navigate. It's costly, and often too doesn't lead to the desired outcome. So now we're going to move on to questions. So for the first 10 or so minutes, we'll take a few questions from the panel to the panel. If anybody wants to either ask or challenge anybody else on the panel, and then we'll open it up for everyone to contribute. In the meantime, please have a think if there's something you want to ask a particular presenter or you want all the panelists to comment on, and do use the bits of paper that we have as well if you want. Anybody want to have a second go? There's been quite a variety of voices.
Shall I just start? Yeah. There's somebody to start. Yeah. First of all, I want to. That wasn't me, it was definitely you. First of all, I want to thank Lorna and Andrew to come forward, because I do know when it comes to debates like this, it's actually very difficult to get the voice of the people. For various reasons. This is a field shrouded in mystery, in anonymity, in aliases, and people scared of being vilified. And I want to make it clear that I'm very grateful for the trust that I receive from all parties, and I always try to honour that. So thank you for sharing your stories. And for Lorna, what I find intriguing, I think you recognise you were very lucky with the number 15 that you hit it off. I'm very sorry to hear that you didn't fulfil your lifelong dream, and just want to get that. But you did say that you had to deal with your fair share of, well, your words, creeps and everything else in the dream. Now you also, because of your background, the way you are, I would assume that you are a fairly strong character. I've had to deal with women who are not, and who couldn't even go through 13 proofs or anything else. Do you think that for the average woman, whatever the average woman is, I know there's no such thing as the average woman, but for the element of this debate, do you think that trying to imagine yourself as not the strong woman that you are, how would you have dealt with the 13, 14 proofs you had to deal with?
Yeah, I definitely take your point, because I, I'm educated, white, middle class, whatever, I had the wherewithal to do what I did in order to keep myself safe, and lots of social support around me to discuss all of this with, and lots of women wouldn't be in that situation. I guess it then brings it on to how is that, I think women are vulnerable, but then I still struggle with the regulating, like when you go onto Tinder, none of that's regulated and people end up in abusive, coercive situations that are through dating websites, but does that mean that we intervene in that? So am I going to be a fence sitter? I'm not sure, I think what I did feel, and I discussed this with my family at the time, that it would be great if there was a little bit of, this is just if you could have your wish list, that there was some counselling involved for everybody that is on there, and that would, I come from a clinical psychology, psychology background, and I'm a big fan of counselling and a big fan of talking about what we're intending to do and exploring that. So if there was some capacity to have something like that somewhere that people could reflect, because I think you are sometimes experimented on with people as well. They don't really know what they want or what they're looking for, and they learn what they want and what they're looking for through meeting people, which is another difficult, tricky kind of situation to be in. So, yeah, I definitely take your point. I definitely think there are a lot of vulnerable women out there that are preyed upon, but I think there are vulnerable women preyed upon in every area of life.
Well, there's people in counselling for it.
Yeah, I think one of the big opportunities here is to improve training at primary care level for GPs. There's many people who are starting fertility journey who have some contact with their GP, be that actual direct seeking fertility treatment or just having checkups to make sure they're in good health, asking questions about pregnancy. And the training for GPs just isn't out there. I'm not aware of, I've got a medical family. I've looked at developing some resources to assist GPs and work with my family members to help draft those. But there's no real way of getting that kind of training out there. I think perhaps one of the things that's interesting to hear about in GPT, is that right? Maybe have the opportunity to get some training materials out for family doctors, because I think that's an ideal time to deliver some of the basic counselling, getting people to think about key issues, understanding the norms, understanding what's safe, what's risky, making sure they understand the procedures. There's lots of other ways that counselling can be developed, and I'd love to see that, but I think that the GP is probably a good place to start in terms of putting a regime together.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment from the panel? Otherwise,
I've just got a quick question. And it was a question for Andrew, where you were talking about, what you view as inordinate cost associated with assisted reproduction. Whilst I'm generally empathetic to that argument, in my experience, most clinics, perhaps not the Harley Street clinics and so on, but the Rosie maternity clinics and so on that are located in Cambridge Hospital and other places like that, most clinics, in my experience, are rather driven by the success rate. That's the thing that matters awful lot to them. And so they want to get there with the most expediency they can possibly manage. So if someone arrives who, let's say, it's a lesbian who wants to use donated gametes to conceive a pregnancy, but there's nothing to suggest there's any problem with her fertility, they would move immediately to kind of IUI into uterine insemination with a syringe or whatever in order to try and just, why not just try and make that pregnancy work as simply as possible. Where the expense comes in is when the person who's presenting is a woman who's already 40 or plus and who wants to conceive a child, but they know that her rate of fertility or the probability of her being able to conceive easily in an unassisted way is much lower, and therefore they're likely to move to forms of assistance like either ovarian hyperstimulation or IVF or donor eggs or something that's more interventionist, But I think that is to secure her desire for her own biological, child in the shortest time frame that she can manage. So, for instance, you can just carry on doing IUI for a long time, which would be less expensive, but it could take, if you're 41 or 42, that could take 2 years or 3 years and more, before you conceive. So I think it's, it can be very expensive, but I think the demand for it is actually mostly driven by the patient and less so by the clinic. That's, you may have thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I can't agree with some of what you said, but I take issue with chunks of it. To me, I think fertility is a bit like driving. If you want to get there safely, be prepared to go at a reasonable speed. Yeah, sure, you can get places faster by driving 100 miles an hour, but you put yourself at an incredible risk by doing so.
Sure.
And many of the problems that you get medically are just through utterly crazy practices that should be banned, like double embryo insertion,
Sure.
which leads to massive numbers of twin births. Like almost all of the twin births now are through ART, from IVF and ART. It poses lifelong problems for the children that result from that. And I fully agree that the pressure can come from the intended parents who are seeking out the fastest route to get pregnant, or they judge fertility clinics purely on the success rate that they have. But this, to me, is exactly why we have a problem with the regulated sector. The role of people should be to intervene to make sure the sector is safe. Now, you can't expect patients to judge the safety of procedures. They're not medics, they're not trained to make these decisions. And while we have profit-making clinics who are not only willing to, but paid to sell invasive fertility treatment to people based on the promised success rates, then inevitably you're going to get the equivalent of people driving 100 miles an hour through a built-up area. Yes, you may get more pregnancies that way, you may get them more quickly, but by God, it puts both the children and the mothers at risk to do so. And yes, it does cost a lot of money. One other point that it's important to make about that is that a lot of the push for IVF and ICSI is because it's much more conservative with the sperm. So if you have a limited sperm supply because you've got a system which doesn't motivate enough donors to come forward to assist people, then you try and cheese pair them out of sperm for every process that you do, and that again leads you to more invasive treatments.
I wonder if we can open it up to the audience now. This is our roaming mic for today. So Anna or Jackie, you're around?
No, she's not.
No? Oh, Anna. Yeah, it would be great if you could just ferry this around carefully because it's quite sensitive. And then I think Joyce might be number one.
I don't think I need a mic.
Just keep it far away from her.
Everyone knows I don't need a mic.
It's for the tape, isn't it?
Sorry?
You need it for the camera, right?
It'd be good for the recording, yeah.
I'll just so I'm Professor Joyce Harper. I gave a talk earlier today in this room called Reproduction Without Sex and What Technology Has to Offer. And I talked quite a lot about egg and sperm donation. And I said that in the future we might not need it because we'll have other technology that will overcome that. But just a couple of points from what you said. So I've worked in IVF for 30 years, and when you prepare the donor sperm for IVF, you will just thaw a vial. So whether you're doing an IUI or an ICSI or an IVF, you'll use exactly the same amount. I don't know any clinic that would do anything different to that. So that's as far as I'm aware. I am definitely for a single embryo transfer, but Laura and I are both parents of twins, as she said. I have IVF twins, and I think your statement was a bit harsh, what you said. A number of twins are born naturally anyway. There are countries where there's no twins, very few twins born by IVF now, countries such as Sweden. Yes, because they are transferring one embryo, but not in everybody. So in some patients, some older patients, that's not really the right thing to do. So I just wanted to correct you on those 2 points.
Well, hold on, if you're going to correct me, you've got to give me a right reply.
Yes, I am.
In my view, that's not correct. Could I have the mic back?
I'm walking, not running with the mic.
So just to respond to those points, the if you're using a single vial, then if you're using IVF, then you can use it to fertilise a number of eggs, and so the overall process is made more efficient by using sperm for the most invasive fertility treatment. So if you use ICSI, using a single sperm to fertilise a single egg, you can transfer and you can store those eggs, you can grow them in a fertility for 14 days, and you can make a transfer with a very high degree of probability that you're going to end up with a pregnancy at the end of it. If you're using IUI, that process is carried out inside the woman's body. It's much less controlled, you have much less guaranteed success on any individual cycle. Okay. What was the second point you remember? Just your memory. About twins. Twins do it kind of naturally. I fully accept that, but there's a reason. There's a reason why the HEFA has got the 1 at a time program, and that's because the risk of prematurity is much higher in twin births. The risk of if you want the scientific citations, I will send them to you.
I do know them.
Okay, which show the risks of a wide variety of health complications for the baby, some of which have lifelong consequences. So there's a reason why these programs exist to try and reduce twin births, and that's because it's dangerous.
Okay, you actually gave the impression that almost every twin children that were born were going to have some lifelong issues, or what you said.
No, that's
it's
not.
not. It's actually a very small.
It's a risk.
It's actually a very small proportion. It's health economics.
Let's not get stuck on that particular point, because it's slightly to the side of the main game for tonight. If I can, I'd like to just bring the mic out again to the audience, if that's okay. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment or ask any particular question to any of the panelists that you've heard from tonight, either to elaborate on their own background or story, or to speak to any particular point that we've covered?
I was going to say something about surrogacy.
Surrogacy, yeah, so Bron, you spoke about surrogacy.
I just wondered what you thought. I was being told that the surrogacy law in India has now changed.
It has.
And and I just wanted your view. So it's now going to be an Indian resident. So I just wondered how you thought that was going to affect the situation in India.
Well, if you want to know the full answer to that question, you'll have to come to my inaugural lecture on surrogacy, which is on the 22nd of March at KCL, in which I discussed that issue at length. I actually think I have little support for the ban on commercial surrogacy in India. I think it's very unthought through, both conceptually and poorly grounded in actual empirical research. Now, the reason why I don't have a lot of support for it is, well, in part because it's highly selective. That's the first thing to say. So it's quite nonsensical in terms of its sort of substantive underpinning. So what I mean by that is it says, commercial surrogacy is, and I quote, an affront to the dignity of womanhood. However, it's okay to do, it's not okay now, in fact it's banned, to do a commercial surrogacy for anyone who is a foreigner or a non-resident Indian, but it's okay if you're a resident Indian. I'm like, huh? Isn't there just a massive sort of conceptual slippage there? Which is, what is it that isn't part of the sort of Modi government's nationalist program, that it's okay to have surrogate children if you're Indian, but not if you're from somewhere else. Now, what I happen to know about part of the motivation for that is that completely in contrary to what we are continually told about foreigners being the primary commissioning parents for surrogacy in India, my research over the last 3 years has shown that, in fact, in the clinics that I went into, that in Mumbai, Jaipur, Bangalore, etc., Delhi, the largest cohort of commissioning parents is actually the rising Indian middle classes. Oh. Yeah. And for whom, by the way, some clinic directors have described to me commercial surrogacy in those clinics in India now as becoming very normalised, quote unquote. And there are such interesting questions about why that is. It's partially about the robust valorisation of the biological child in India, so people wanting to have a child that is at least partially genetically linked to them rather than being adopted. So there is a lot of drive for that service in India, and that is probably why the service in India, the commercial service in India for Indian people has not been banned. But therefore, you know, what that's saying is, oh, we'll divert that other market, you know, the foreigners, the foreign market, as it were, to somewhere else. We'll just shove it offshore. And it does go somewhere else, and we know where it goes. We know, I can tell you the geography of exactly, you know, where it has gone and it is going. So it's gone to Mexico, it's gone to Thailand, it's now in Cambodia. I get kind of reports from people giving me estimations of how long they think the market will stay open there before it will close. So at the moment, people in Cambodia say, they think maybe 2 years, and then that market will close and then it'll open somewhere else. It's opened and closed in India, so you see what I mean. It's a movable situation.
If I may, because let's stay with that. Stay with you and stay with the topic in a sense that you did mention in your when you spoke earlier. You said that the situation in the UK in terms of accessing fertility on the internet is actually less regulated, in your opinion, than the contractual arrangements that you see in many of these countries, including India. So what I thought would be useful to wrap up would be to ask each of the panelists again to, in a sentence or two, I know that will be a challenge, but in less than a minute, to address the specific question based on what you know, your expertise, but also on the comments from your fellow panelists today. Whether you think on the balance of harms and benefits, the current situation of accessing fertility online is fair play or too risky, or and there should be more regulation, and that's the question of the debate. And then I'd like to ask the audience by a show of hands to indicate where they sit on the issue after hearing all the sides as well. So if I can ask you to take this, just give your kind of bottom line in a minute.
I mean, you know, to me, the key question here is a rather anthropological one, if I can put it that way, which is that, you know, we've heard from the other panellists saying, well, we don't regulate all manner of other social engagements and exchanges between people, whether they're, you know, online or in real life. So why would we seek to intervene in this in the way that we do? And I don't think that has been, to my mind anyway, particularly well formulated so far, what the rationale is for intervening in this particular situation in a way that we don't in others. So we would have to ask ourselves, what is the work that we would seek regulation to perform in this context? So if we were to introduce a lot of regulation of online provision, what would we want that to do? Or what do we think it would be capable of doing? And of course the risk is that people always subvert that anyway by just going off-piste, if I could use the scheme, you know, analogy, and going, I'm just not going to do that via this website, then I'll just do it via texting or something else. So as Lucy was correctly saying, in a platform network, you know, peer-to-peer society, the question of who will do the regulating and how it will be possible to do that, I'm not sure, but I think we need to reflect a little bit more on what we think are the key things or the key freedoms to protect. So is that to protect from exploitation? Is that to protect from risk, bodily, psychosocial, or whatever? And what are the means through which we could deliver that? So for instance, as Lorna was saying about counselling, you know, perhaps it's the case that what you want people to do is to, more than anything, understand what they're getting into and what the risks are and how they could address those if they encounter them. So I think that's the question we really have to focus on.
We Dutch take a very pragmatic view. Things happen, and there's not much point in trying to forbid them. We don't do it with alcohol, sex, and everything else. We just try to create a framework that's done in the safest way. We allow constitution, we just check them. Because we accept that things happen. I think we have to accept that these things will happen and will continue to grow, because there's a growing number of customers and users, and they're not patients. We talked about IVF, but I think that was a nonsense argument, because the majority of women who go online do not even go via IVF. They realize there's a missing component, they can find it somewhere else. And on one hand, I say good to them. So in that sense, I say fair play. I think we just need to be clearer about the small print. By pretending it doesn't happen, we're not clear about that, and I think it's actually more risky. I think we do need to have a national framework or something, a national body who accepts and puts some counselling in place, whatever it is, so women, customers, do not have to go find themselves in situations that they meet strange guys in a travel lodge. Where does it differ from normal life is that in the end, we've got a child. And if you Tinder, you go to Tinder and everything else, you meet up with a guy, and it's you there doing all sorts of things. But there are children there, which at this stage do not have a vote. So I go back, it's risky business, but we can make it fair play.
I think today we've been talking about a number of risky businesses and a number of plays going on. So whether we're talking about people meeting each other for co-parenting, people specifically looking for sperm, people looking for eggs, people looking for surrogacy, these all bring up a number of different questions. And fortunately in the UK there is a regulatory framework, but at the same time you have to keep into account that the world is changing and that the online platforms play an important role in that. So I think it's not really an either-or question, but in terms of looking at the risks, to me the important risks are that we are taken away from having access to a lot of the platforms that are created at the moment. So while a lot of the public discussion is concerned with the people either receiving gametes or giving away gametes, I think we need to be really careful about who makes money with what kind of actions and who controls whom, and what are the structural changes that occur in that case. So not specifically ethical ideas, this is okay, this is not okay, but what is happening on a broader societal scale and on a global scale. And in order to address that, we have to look at those structural developments, both online and both in the confrontation of the online situations and the regulatory situations.
I think for me, it's a little hard to make a definitive sort of answer without knowing what regulation would look like and what it would mean from my perspective. What does that actually mean? What does it look like from the point of a user? But I'll sort of go back to my initial point about, well, I'll sort of second what you were saying about things are going to happen, people are going to do what they're going to do, and sometimes the more things are regulated, the more it drives things underground, maybe then it's less transparent and less protection. So I guess with that in mind, I would be a proponent of education and of potentially counselling. There's all sorts of things, and maybe this is part of regulation, I don't know, but there are things you can do on websites that you could make people go through certain education sort of screens before they got to the actual access to it. So there are things that you can do. Is that regulation? I'm not sure. But I'd be up for that. And delivering education before people are able to access stuff, yeah, that would be great. And if there's a potential of counselling. And then you can also see as this becomes more of our everyday world, that maybe this needs to be part of sex education in schools about what's out there on the internet and internet safety. I think that comes into another area of education. So there's lots of ways that this, people could be educated into the pitfalls and the risks that are involved in this area. And I'd probably be more of a proponent in that area, I think.
Yeah, I think the sex is fair play, and the state should be regulating what we do with our bodies and what we do as parents, biological or otherwise. But it's also risky, like driving is risky. You drive sensibly and the risks are acceptable, you drive like a fool and they're not. Is it possible the state could introduce more support, more rules, more regulation to try and make things better? Would a 20 limit in our towns make things safer? Yes, I think it would. If we were to introduce more regulation, what would it look like? And my suggestion is that having a standard procedure for donors to disclose their medical records to potential recipients, including doctors of training, to match donors and recipients effectively would be a huge step forward. Putting in place programs of counselling and education delivered either at primary healthcare or level or through the education system, again, would be a huge step forward. to have a legal framework which permitted valid donor-recipient contracts, so there was proper legal recognition for all forms of donor-recipient and co-parent relationships, something which is woefully lacking and inexcusably so at the moment. And finally, we already have a reasonably reliable register of births which is maintained by the HFEA for clinic births, and there is, in my view, absolutely no reason why that register cannot be opened up to private donations as well. It's not particularly dangerous for someone to have dozens of biological children, provided you know where they all are, and provided the kids know where the other kids are. So those are easy, quick wins, not expensive, not invasive, don't change the world for people who are seeking treatment, but make a massive difference in terms of reducing the level of risky business.
Thank you all. I'd now like to ask you in the audience to essentially throw your votes, I suppose, on 3 different questions. The first one would be whether you think, after making up your own mind, accessing fertility online as it currently stands more or less is fair play, whether you think it's risky business, or whether you think the question should be rephrased in, we've heard some good examples of more insightful, more complicated perhaps, ways of asking the same question and reformulating it. And I think that's been one of the merits of this evening. So to sum up, let's, by the way, make sure you fill in the feedback form before you go, which is on each of the aisles as well. So we've heard about the current status quo of the sector, both regulated and unregulated. We've heard about the fact that there is a structural inequality as part of this when it comes to costs, that there is an age factor here that we may not have thought about when it comes to the definition of womanhood and the definition of what it means to be fertile. We've heard, I think quite persuasively, in my own opinion, that the regulated sector might actually be a smaller proportion of the market, if you think about it as in both sectors, than the unregulated, and the need for protection in that context. I think on International Women's Day, it would be important for us not to be paternalistic and allow women the maximum amount of reproductive autonomy in this in this business, and that would be appropriate for a day like today. And there is a lot of unmet need amongst women and couples and people seeking fertility, and it's clear that the regulated sector is in some ways not meeting that need, if that's for access or cost. And finally, I think it comes down to very basic questions in ethics about whose freedoms, like Bronwyn said, are we protecting, and which freedoms come into this conversation. And I suppose that's the benefit of a debate like this, more education for all of us, not just for doctors and donors, on this topic. So if I can ask you by a show of hands, is buying fertility online according to your own opinion fair play? Raise your hand. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 20, 30 hands or so. Is it currently a risky business to the extent that you think it's troublesome? And we have about 20 hands, and you can raise your hands more than once, by the way. Do you think the question needs further probing and debate? All right. Well, there's an opportunity to do that just now. You'll be pleased to hear, because there's very kindly we've been. Have a sponsored wine reception in the North Cloisters. Before we do that, I just wanted to thank the people who are on the organizing committee for tonight. So Vaz, who's manned the camera on the front, and done so many different things besides. Jacqueline Nichols, who helped with organizing, and Anna Gubijev as well, with all kinds of big and small tasks. And Judith Stevenson and the whole International Women's Day team at UCL. I wanted to highlight as well before we go. This is the program event this week. We're sort of in the middle there. As you can see, tomorrow there's what we call a story booth, which is an opportunity to hear stories and actually tell your own about being a woman at UCL or at all. And then we have a sold out event tomorrow night, which is 2 comedians, Laura Bates from Everyday Sexism, and then a lunch hour lecture about ovarian screening on Thursday midday. We're going to, you can book all the events at uclwomensday.org. We're going to go to North Cloisters in a few minutes, which is inside the main part. We're sort of down here at the moment. You can go through Mallet Place into the main UCL room in the top north corner, where there'll be a wine reception. What have I forgotten to do?
Nothing.
Nothing. Thank you.
Thank you.